It's a simple looking interaction, but it took us a lot of iteration and exploration to get there.
That's a tough one to cut. Like for me, my initial reaction is like, oh, it looks so nice.
The guiding product principle is like, we didn't want to do that. We didn't want to get in your way.
Oh, and here you see how it's built, right? It's like dissolved transitioning between all these different states.
There was just this magic when people saw repro steps. Like, that's the magic. Like, that's the thing I wanted to see.
If you're watching this episode, I think you want to see the Figma. So that's what we're going to show you today. We're going to take you into our design graveyard behind our most recent AI feature. Why are we doing this? We know a lot of people out there are building their own AI features, and we want to share more from our experience building ours. You're probably asking yourselves a lot of the same questions that we were. What's the best user experience for AI? Should it be opt-in or opt-out? What should it look like? Should it be more purple or more grayscale? There's no better person I can think to ask than Chris from our design team, who's going to take us through 0 to 1 how we designed our feature. I'd say let's start with where we are today, and let's start with like where we sort of ended up going, and then I'd say we start the tour, go back and see all the path that it took to get here. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds good. Here's kind of where we landed. Let me load up the prototype. And here's the kind of overall experience, right? You're creating a jam, you open up, you capture it, then you have the window here called the create modal, where you are entering to get information or describing the bug, whatever your workflow is, right? And so the way the AI works is it kind of auto fills a title. In the case of the Jira ticket, it's going to do the title for me, and then it's going to auto generate steps to reproduce. And so the UX that we have, I'm just going to keep replaying it because this is really just showing the core interaction here. There's this brief loading state. In the build, we have more of a type out kind of reveal animation, but in the case of the Figma prototype, just showing kind of like placeholder text that you then either tab, use your keyboard tab to accept the results, or you could kind of click this element here to do that, and then they kind of lock into place on your screen.
And I'll put a little video on top of what that reveal looks like in the build, because it's a nice one.
There's a lot of nice details in there if you get up close. But yeah, going back to the file, it's a simple looking interaction, but it took us a lot of iteration and exploration to get there. And so yeah, like going through some of the graveyard designs here, which kind of mapped to like the beginning of the journey, like when we first started, what our ideas were about it and kind of how things have changed over time. So we started with some like very simple concept storyboards, and kind of in the beginning of this process, it started as kind of title only, right? So we were trying to figure out like what is the overall user experience and interaction that we wanted, with trying to keep this really seamless with a user's workflow. Like we didn't want the AI feature to get in the way. We didn't want it to be too loud. And so when we started, we were thinking about how does this thing start writing for you in a way where if that's helpful for you, you can just let it do its thing. But yeah, some of these early explorations we're looking at, if it is a title that comes in by itself, how do we indicate that to you as a user? Like what's happening here? How do we visually communicate it? And so this first concept was there'd be this little kind of gradient stroke around the input field, and it kind of reveals after a couple seconds of loading. We also had the idea of maybe there's, like Notion and other products like that, as their way to get to more AI functions through like a keyboard command such as / because we didn't at this stage kind of know exactly what types of content or actions we might support. And so I'll get into some of that in a little bit. But yeah, we're even looking at stuff like, like how much communication do we do up front if you're experiencing this for the first time and you see something kind of pop in? Do we need to tell you, hey, here's what just happened? Like we wrote your title for you. This is a new Jam AI feature, and hey, you don't want that, you can go manage your settings. We ended up kind of going for a different approach here, but you can see some of these early explorations, which were, a little heavy on the gradient, as you might notice. And that's something you'll see through the archive, like slowly doing less and less of that. And I guess one of the reasons was, like the sparkle icon for AI that you'll see in so many products today, and that kind of gradient treatment. At first, we're like, ooh, yes, like we are also, part of that crowd, and we're gonna, there's kind of a visual lexicon and shorthand that comes with AI features now. But the more that we lived with it and sat with it, we did less and less of that, and we liked it more and more. And again, I think that goes to the principle of like really trying to figure out a way to integrate this in a seamless way where it didn't feel like this feature on top of the editor, or this, even though it is the AI feature, like that's really built into the workflow. Mm-hmm. So from the beginning, we were trying to think through, how do we do this thing where the title comes in kind of automatically as a placeholder, but then you have this additional action you can take of adding repro steps to the description. And just nailing that interaction was one of the trickier things, because the title comes in by itself, and the idea, at least at the beginning, was to have repro steps be optional. Like it may be relevant for you, may not be. And so we're trying to think about how to let the user do that in a way where, again, it was kind of on demand, not in the way. And yeah, I forgot about this one, but this one felt way too hidden, right? So the idea was, when you're editing or adding text, we have this little format toolbar that comes up. And is there a natural entry point for the feature here where if you wanted to regenerate or add additional things, it felt like maybe a kind of natural placement for that. But as we got into it, A, it felt a little bit too hidden. And then B, the kinds of, because it's, title and steps to reproduce, we found that doing it in context was just kind of a lot more of a clear user experience. And this provides just too much UI, too much Chrome around. Yeah,
too much decisions too, right? It feels like a summary. Do I want a summary? Do I want the repro steps? Yeah, like it's just this. It feels like a decision that you don't need to make,
And there's the UI to look at, but also words to think about. Where you have to think about like, what is a summary? What are repro steps? Like, do I manage my settings? And again, this is all hidden through an action. Mm-hmm. But it was all in spirit of, again, trying to figure out how do we not get in the user's way and have all these buttons, on top of things, and have this really loud kind of experience where, again, we wanted it to feel super seamless and very much integrated into the creation experience. Mm-hmm. For title, we were trying to decide in the beginning if that should be user initiated or if it should come in by itself, again, as kind of a suggested placeholder. And we ended up going with the placeholder route, but the explorations here are like, if it is user, like a user action that creates it, is there a little bug or icon that we could put in line next to the title that, again, would be out of your way? It's like you wanted to start typing, it would disappear. But as you hovered over it, maybe it would tell you like what it is. And once we do that once, you then kind of learn what that does, and you can easily reach for it next time. And again, why we moved away from it was just this idea of like, given enough confidence in the data that we can feed it, if we can get you a good result and get a pretty good guess at what you might be trying to write, let's just show that to you, and then you can easily delete it if you don't want it.
So this is related to an opt-in, opt-out question. Like,
exactly.
So the options would be either, because there is going to be this lag or this generation time that feels like relevant too. Like, should it auto? Is it something that you would say, all right, now begin the AI generation, then you wait, then it goes, or is it just automatically going, then pre-fills for you? And perhaps you could be annoyed that it pre-filled something if you wanted to presumably write something else. Is that kind of
Yeah,
the decision, right?
yeah, exactly. And there's this kind of technical constraint that's a range, which is challenging, right? So whenever you're sending data to an LLM and getting it back, there's a delay, and the different media types have different processing times. So one big thing that we did a lot of iteration on is kind of the loading state and communication, and how much of that to make a brand moment, because you kind of are making the best of the time that you have, and you can turn a constraint into something kind of interesting and cool, and have a little bit of a brand moment there.
Yeah.
You're mentioning opt-in and opt-out, and one thing we were trying to figure out up front, I'll just load this prototype here, is once it generates a result, how do we communicate that you can keep this or easily delete it? So we were looking at different interaction patterns for that. This one is like showing a menu to accept or delete after it generates. And, it makes it really clear that something just happened and you're kind of in control for what to do with it. But again, it's just thinking about how it could be more and more seamless and more invisible. We came up with the idea of it just kind of rendering it in a lighter gray placeholder with some nice kind of animation effects. But we do that by default, and then you just going to move to the next line if you want to keep it. There's another prototype here this was a little bit more of a technical thing we had to figure out when we were building it, which is kind of tracking the usefulness of the generated results.
Could you zoom on one of those frames where it's showing the thumbs up? Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I think like people are pretty used to, if they're using an AI product like ChatGPT, to see this feedback, this more explicit feedback mechanism of kind of thumbs up, thumbs down next to the generated result. And so this is showing the frames of,
And then thanks. Yeah.
yeah, do we just is it just a on off, like accept it or not? Do we want to actually collect, like have a space for people to write something? And it's interesting, we actually had this built for a few weeks, and what we found was we could basically rely on the implicit signals instead that would give us more or less the same results. Meaning, if you created the jam and kept the AI generation, then that was signal to us that it was at least good enough for you to move on with your workflow. And it's kind of like hitting a thumbs up. What we also found is when people did share feedback on it, they would be putting in the feedback they'd be sharing was actually a corrected version, or like the version that they wanted to see.
Oh, it was like they were giving feedback to the generation, not like feedback to you, Chris, the designer. Yeah, totally.
And of course, that makes total sense now, but it was one of those things at the beginning. I think the feedback was thought about to be more generic, right? Like it didn't include this, but people were actually just saying, here's what I wanted it to say.
There is $1 million on the line. make this 10x better. That's so funny. What an insight though about like a future potential way to take the feature too, that like if a little feedback thing could reinforce how it's generating the title. That's kind of interesting, but I could totally see at this stage how that was not a priority. Like let's table this.
Yeah.
Like this is just causing confusion, right?
Right. And so this design here was again trying to figure out, okay, if we do a feedback mechanism, how do you do that in a lightweight way, right? So you don't always see the thumbs up, thumbs down. They show up kind of like when you are hovering or interacting with the generated text.
Mhm.
Um, but it ended up just being one more thing that we could remove. And again, just rely on like if people are keeping the generated text and creating jams, if they're replacing it with something else, like we're getting all those signals and it's, like really good data. And we didn't actually need to collect feedback in a more granular way. So that was kind of an
Wow.
interesting one.
Wow, that's a tough one to cut. Like for me, my initial reaction is like, "Oh, it looks so nice. It seems so smart, right?" And maybe you put all this effort into making that look amazing, and then just like, nope, nope, that's a tough one.
Yeah. Well, and it was one of those things that we probably designed and built in a couple hours. And it was just like, let's get some more feedback. Let's try to get more signal about like the reasons why, if people are deleting it or, like what are the reasons for that so we can try to fine tune the model. So another thing we chatted about is for a product like this, where you have a technical constraint like loading time, right, and variable loading time, sending stuff to an LLM and getting it back. There's this loading moment which could take anywhere from a second or 5 or 6 seconds, depending on what model you're using. So let me load this prototype here, but
Oh, because it's just so annoying to wait. And it feels like the question everyone is going through with all like building these new AI features is how do you have people wait in a way that's the most like reasonable and like just doesn't make you want to pull your hair out, right?
it's a thing to be balanced, right? You could either keep it really minimal and maybe depending on the LLM you're using, things are going to take more in the realm of 1 to 3 seconds, which is kind of what it ended up being in our case. But at the beginning, we didn't quite know exactly what we'd be dealing with. So we did spend a lot of time thinking about if we have 5 or 6 seconds that we need to take to give you some results back, can we make that kind of engaging and visually compelling and maybe even a little cheeky and fun?
Mm-hmm.
So this one was like going into more visual candy and visual effects.
Wait, I was like, you need to show that a bit closer.
Yeah.
Oh my
Oh,
gosh, look at that! That magic. Wow. And like, were you looking at other design inspiration from other tools to make something like that, or did that just like how'd you do that?
it's probably subconscious influences. Again,
Uh
that
huh.
one really leaned into here. Let me actually pan over here.
Oh,
So
and here you see how it's built, right? It's like dissolved transitioning between all these different states.
yeah,
Or
and there's a lot you can do in Figma with animation using prototyping tools, right? So that effect that you see here that you saw before of kind of sparkles going and this kind of ambient glowing orb of color, that's just layered components put on top of each other, right? So in this case, we have these two elements put on top of each other. It's the star animation on basically like a blurred out circle, and each are going through animation loops. So you can see
Mhm.
the components here. Like here's the star. It's going from this state to this state to this state, and you're in Figma specifying. You're basically creating a chain and telling it, okay, after this many milliseconds, animate to the next frame,
Mhm.
and then animate to the next frame. And you can create pretty robust and complicated looking animations just by layering and stacking different components.
Oh, and I can see where you're going with that one. This like thinking bar in the bottom of the middle of your screen right there. How it has those three buttons and they're kind of doing this like wave thing there.
Yeah,
Wow, that's really fun to see. Is that where you're going with the animations too? Is that the next exploration or the next variation
yeah,
too?
So there were a couple ingredients we were playing with for animation. Let me load this one again because there's a couple of things we know we wanted to do, and some are like so in Figma, we actually didn't spend any time trying to recreate that kind of glowing orb animation in code because we could do it in Figma, do a GIF, and then basically like plop it in the experience in this really early like beta period and feel it out in a more realistic context before investing a lot of time. And I'm actually glad we did that approach because we ended up like not using that at all and really like dialing back the amount of animation.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll kind of cycle through these different words here, and then you see how it's typing out.
Mm-hmm.
But I did want to just try to just get the overall like sense of timing, and should it fade or not? Is there delay between the words? Does it feel like a typewriter, or is it something really smooth? And those are all things you think about when you think about the kind of like brand and feeling and kind of like identity of the feature,
Mm-hmm.
because you can breathe a lot of life into seemingly small things like this, and they all kind of combine together to create this kind of nice orchestration of interaction.
And what was our taste? Like, what did we actually like ultimately choose for our intro animation?
Yeah, so if we think about just the idea that it should feel seamless and integrated and fast, right? There's this balance of animation where like you want it to happen fast enough where you feel like you don't have to sit around and wait for it, but slow enough where you can actually see what it's doing. So we ended up in a place where it was like pretty quick and a little minimal fade, but that it feels like we tried looking at it with delays between words, more like typewriter, and it just felt like too slow, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we did a lot of iteration, and we even have some modifiers in the code where, like, depending on the length of text, we either speed up the animation or slow it down,
Oh,
because
great,
the
great
more you
detail.
have, right, the longer perceived time, even if the animation duration is the same, it'll feel like it's taking longer for longer text, and it will feel like lightning fast if it's just a line. So we had to do some way of kind of making those feel more uniform. Here, if I go back to the final version, it says type a title or wait for AI. And then there's that really small the dot loader animation. And
Mm-hmm.
that's really like some of the only animation from the loading states that survived. And that's because like we feel like we do most of the communication in this placeholder text. And it felt like the most clear to us after just going through lots of rounds, right? But it's like, do you put it in with the text somehow, or do
Mm-hmm.
you put that communication of what's happening somewhere else on the screen? And we just felt like for all these other versions where we were putting it in a different place than the thing that was actually being processed, it got too much in the way, and yeah, it just felt like too much. Yeah, then the final bucket of things from the archive is once we got title in a good place and kind of got a lot of the technical aspects of that worked out, we then were thinking about how do we layer in repro steps, right? So if you record a video, we automatically kind of detect what those core interaction events were and even associate a timestamp with it. Like one of the things we were just unsure about is it more like a thing that you could add optionally,
Mm.
um, accessed by some trigger, right? So if you're typing a description, maybe you want to type something and then you add steps to reproduce underneath, or maybe you actually don't want them at all. And so we were just looking at different models for what is like what is the trigger? Like, is it some user initiated thing where if we're filling in title automatically, do we add repro steps together with that and just show everything up front? Or do we have it more like these blocks that you could add in?
And does everyone want all reproduction steps automatically? That's kind of seems like an assumption or question. Like, is it going to be important that everyone wants reproduction steps of what you just saw in that video, or is it something that, in X% of cases we wouldn't really need, so it doesn't make sense to show to everyone? Yeah, that's an important question.
Yeah, and flipping back to kind of where we landed, one of the changes we made later was actually the decision to merge them and show them all up front. And this was like mostly driven by user feedback sessions that we were, had a lot of users doing early access and giving feedback on the beta along the way. And there was just this magic when people saw repro steps, like, oh, like, I mean, it was clear how to do it, but that's the magic. Like, that's the thing I wanted to see. And not only would it not get in my way if it was generated and I didn't want it, like I could just delete it, but actually, maybe if I didn't include it, now I will, because it provides that much more value.
Yeah, and it's not hidden behind some drop-down toolbar button.
And so the assumption actually driving why it wasn't included turned out to be a little bit wrong, which is we were thinking initially people might want more fine-tuned control and kind of thinking block by block. Like if we're doing a title for you to get you started, but then kind of leaving it up to you and thinking about, again, like these discrete actions or ingredients that you could add to your ticket or to your jam. Again, just thinking about giving more control to the user and not assuming that they wanted to see everything up front. Like, because you could imagine you generate all this stuff and you show it there and it's kind of overwhelming. And that was like exactly the guiding product principle is like, we didn't want to do that. We didn't want to get in your way. We didn't want to show you stuff that would get in your way of your workflow.
You don't want, yeah.
So we actually took a more conservative approach initially, but yeah, I think just people seeing this are like, show it to me all up front. Like, if I want to make a change or delete it, I'll do that.
If you like this episode, I think you'd love the episode that we shared 2 weeks ago with Martin, our other product designer, going behind our design system and component library. If you have any topics you'd like us to cover in a future episode, make sure to let us know in the comments, or you can reach out to me at ian@jam.dev, and I'd love to hear your ideas for what we should cover next.